How
Keith,
are you?
great, man. It's great to be back here with you.
We're back again. So today we were going to talk about the Egregore, which we'll kind of go into what that is, and then just coming out of an Egregore, coming out of kind of pretty sophisticated left-wing project that we were involved in, and how we kind of that was one way to think about it, was that it was an Egregore and how to get out of that. And so the idea of the Egregore, Mark Stavish just wrote this book, I guess last year, describing this idea. And so I think the best way to understand what that is, there's actually a scientist that's been talking about the mass what's he called, mass psychosis formation, or
Yeah.
mass hypnosis formation. Same idea, right? Similar idea. An egregore is a thought form that is participated in by lots of people. So a nation could be an egregore if there's a strong sense of patriotism. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. It could be negative, it could be positive, right? That's not really it's not so much good or bad. It's the spirit of the core, right? That's a kind of egregore. A team can have an egregore. A thought form, one way of thinking about a thought form, maybe to take it back to the individual level. An example I often give is when I was a little kid, my cousin lived across the street, and his mom would always introduce him by saying, this is Craig, he's shy. And so this was the thought form, right? He's shy. He embodied this for, I think, his entire, I haven't seen him in years, but into adulthood, he was shy. He never spoke to adults when we were kids. Every time someone like kind of was, what's up with this guy? He's shy. The teachers at school, he's shy. So this is just an idea, right?
It's like a
That
spell casting.
it was a spell. It was a spell. And we were little kids, so I thought that like being shy was some sort of affliction. I thought he had like a doctor's diagnosis or something. I didn't know what this was. He's shy.
Poor guy.
But right. I mean, around us, he was totally normal. Like we would just, we'd play and it was totally fine. But then if an adult came, it, his whole personality changed.
Mm.
So that's like an individual example, right? On the individual level. And that's also the way that positive affirmations work, right?
Mm.
As the opposite, right? But you can do this to yourself, or you can, if you listen to people talk, you can kind of see what thought forms, what phrases they repeat to themselves over and over, which kind of can limit them, right? In NLP, they call it limiting beliefs, right? So these things that people just kind of constantly say, I can't succeed, I always lose, I'm always cold, whatever, whatever.
Mm.
I'm tired, that they just kind of repeat these phrases, and those are thought forms, and those things can become powerful. They can become almost separate entities. And when it happens in a group, it can kind of it also takes on a kind of spirit of its own. So a team, it could be a high school team, it could be a professional team. Even if you watch professional sports, a lot of these teams, especially for a year, they'll really kind of, if they're successful, they'll kind of have that spirit around them, and you kind of get that sense that there's something bigger than just the team that's at work.
Yeah, this
Um,
idea that it takes on a life of its own, I find to be really compelling because we've all, I think, experienced like being in a crowd where we're pulled along with a certain energy.
yeah,
It doesn't
yeah,
even have to be anybody saying anything to you. You could be at a rock concert and you just feel moved to just go along with the flow of events.
right,
Energy.
right.
That's
Bigger than
there.
the sum of its parts, right? There's a bigger thing. And so when you have something like we were involved in, where you're talking about, communism, this is an egregore, right? A spirit that's been around. I mean, it kind of begins even in the French Revolution, and it's kind of in the background there, and it's brought to the fore. Um, Even before Marx, there's these utopian socialist thinkers, Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier and these guys, the utopian socialist, and in the States, Bellamy, the guy who wrote Looking Backwards. So there's this development of these ideas, but with Marx, and then really in the 20th century with the communist revolutions, it really starts to take on a much more intense spirit. It becomes a real idea, right? And it really moves people. And if you watch a movie like Casablanca, they're talking about it in the background. There's the great movement, and they don't even use the name communism, but this is the idea in the background of a movie like that. And so that, for us, it developed into some of the stuff that was going on in the 60s, and it was kind of the most radical expression of the social movements of the 60s was this idea of communism. And it's influencing the civil rights movement. You have the Black Panthers coming out of, they're influenced by that. They're really kind of enchanted by Mao and Maoism, and the stuff that we ultimately got involved in comes out of that also. Baraka is the first, so a mini Baraka, right? This is our the man behind the spirit for us, the real person that's communicating to us, I think, communicating these ideas to us in a living way, right? So he's like the living embodiment of this spirit in our experience.
Now, Keith, could I jump in for a second here?
Please.
Because most people, if people are hearing this on my YouTube channel, most folks wouldn't know me through, my former leftist community.
Right.
So maybe just a little bit of a thumbnail sketch on how you and I met, the time and the place.
Yeah.
We've known each other for damn near
a long time.
years, which is
a long time.
Extraordinary.
So, yeah, right. So we are at Rutgers University in the 90s, and Amity Baraka had been a teacher there, right?
In Brunswick, New
Jersey.
Yes.
And he had been a teacher there. And so influencing students that way. And he was going for tenure and was denied tenure. And that became a kind of social movement at Rutgers around
based upon his radical
tenure. Yeah, not getting tenure because of his radical politics. Also, he was in the English department as a professor. So this is not, his view was that he was denied because of radical politics, but he didn't really have academic scholarship. That was the basis for them not giving him tenure. And that was true. Whether or not he deserves tenure or not, that's a separate thing. But it is true that he didn't have, literary criticism. He wasn't doing that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that's why he didn't get tenure. So he was there. So, and that's where we met, in that milieu of radicalism at Rutgers. And, nowadays with the woke stuff and leftism is very popular. At that time, it wasn't. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, and we were, this was an underground kind of fringe idea.
This is the mid-90s.
Mid-90s, or even early 90s, right? 90, 93.
We met in 94.
94 is when Baraka spoke at Rutgers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a profound event for me. But one thing, just, if you're kind of looking at the world now, you're like, how could you be interested in leftist politics, right? So at the time, if you were interested in freedom of speech, if you were just interested in the ideas of freedom, that was going to put you on the left, right? Even in the 60s, the stuff that happened in Berkeley, if you go and watch like Berkeley in the 60s on PBS or something like that, it was a free speech movement, right? It was about freedom of speech. It was about putting out literature that was opposing the Vietnam War, or was opposing segregation, but it was really a free speech movement. And that was what I was really attracted to.
Yeah, if you were moved by compassion and inclined towards justice, you were just sort of naturally, and you were young at that
And
time,
you're young, so that's
drawn to the left.
a norm of being young. But I was certainly towards libertinism more than anything, and that certainly being drawn to those ideas of kind of just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But that was a left wing thing at that time. Freedom of speech was a left-wing thing. The ACLU at that time was defending the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan marched in Evanston, Illinois in the 80s, and the ACLU defended them, saying they had the right to speak freely. So they were taking an absolutist stance on freedom of speech. I don't know if you remember in 1988, on the left, those are the left. So in 1988, Michael Dukakis is running for president. He's debating George H. Bush. And Bush says Dukakis is a card-carrying member of the ACLU. That was a slur that he tried to use, and that was fascinating to me. I was like, well, I'm going to get involved in the ACLU. That was right for my thing. I'm like all about freedom of speech. And we're still all about freedom of speech. So something else, right? Something else has changed.
Yeah, the left us.
Not us, right? In some ways, right? In some ways, maybe we've learned something. But anyway, so we're in the 90s. Barack is at Rutgers. The freedom movement, if you think about that, was a left-wing thing. The first organization that we were involved in together, the New Jersey Freedom Organization, it was called the New Jersey Freedom Organization. That was always our watchword. That was always the thing that we were pushing. And the promise of leftism, of communism, of Marxism was more freedom, right? That somehow your material needs would be taken care of so that you could experience leisure, have the life of leisure. That was always the promise of the wealthy, right? The real, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, the aristocrats, the wealthy, philosophers, Plato, they had a disdain for work, right? Which is why they justified slavery, why they wrote in favor of slavery, is because they had a disdain for work. For them, work was something not right. What they wanted to do was be men of leisure and think about philosophy and have spiritual pursuits and so forth. And so, at least when I was introduced to ideas of communism, that's what was being promised was this is for everyone. We're going to have the opportunities for leisure, right? Which is the life of a free man, a man of culture, a person of culture, philosophy, spiritual life, right? All these things that you don't have time for when you're working, would be made available to you because your material needs would be taken care of. And when we were young, I felt very impressed by work. I really,
as I recall, yes, you did, Keith.
Going to work, it felt very impressive to me. I was keenly aware that I had a 22-year-old's body, and that this wasn't going to last forever, right? And that these are beautiful days in this young man's body, and I have to go to work when I should be able to whatever. At least that was my idea.
We would print pocket-sized pamphlets that we'd sneak into work.
Right. That was our whole
closets and
thing, right? Our whole propaganda campaign was sneak it to work. Yeah, sneak this stuff to work and somehow get out of work.
But we were just to kind of piggyback on that, we were really devoted to this path, like this idea that you change the conditions in order to change consciousness. So we would debate other people on the left or leftist inclinations or liberal progressives back in that time that were maybe more, free thinking in that time. And we would debate them and insist on this line. It was all about having the right line, the correct line.
That was part of the Egregore, right? You have the right idea. You have the right idea.
Yeah.
Your idea is right, which is political correctness, right? That's where political correctness comes from. People think now political correctness is like anti-racism or something, but political correctness comes from the idea there's one right idea that will advance the project forward somehow, right?
And that
And that's
idea about consciousness being rooted in your conditions, that you had to actually engage in the struggle to change conditions in order to develop your own consciousness,
right.
which is, I believe, an inversion of where we've arrived
It's
at
an
now.
aversion.
So it's a journey. It's been a journey to get out
That
of
so that as an aside, that are part of it, that's the materialist premise, right? And Marx was a materialist, right? So Marx was the kind of figure behind this, but he's a materialist. He's saying that consciousness is derived from material conditions. You can kind of figure out any literary production, any philosophy, right? That's all ideology, and it's just a manifestation of some material interest that's hidden beneath it that you can just kind of figure out, right? Plato justifies slavery because he had slaves, right, or whatever. So there's some way of parsing out people's ideas where they're just justifications for their material conditions, right? It's just a justification for the way that they get their wealth. And that's the idea, right? That's the way that you're looking at it. So this became like a powerful, the egregore part, right? Is
the thought
this
form.
this thought form that kind of gripped us, and I think our friends and the people that we were working with at that time were all kind of enthralled to this thing. And the way that it works isn't just that you just submit to it, you're also contributing to it. So right, so we're putting our energies into it and our ideas into it, right? And so even though we're disagreeing at times with each other, our energies are all going into that. I mean, the amount of energy that we put into that, we could have built massive businesses, empires, really. We were fighting against, we were in the 90s where these ideas were really not popular. We were putting massive amount of energy into them. And, I don't want to overstate our importance, but when I see what's happened, right, how dominating the left is today, I can't help but think that we unfortunately contributed to that.
Yeah, we were on the backs of people that came before us, but I think we were instrumental in the flow of events, sort of bridging, the long decade of the 60s, 70s into what we have now. I mean, we were plugged in at a really pivotal time, carrying those ideas forward and really propagating them.
Yeah, which turned out to be a disaster. But before we get to that, right, so just the idea that you're contributing to the thought form, but it's also controlling you, right? It's also starting to direct you, and it's starting to limit what your possibilities are, right? This is going to be your life, right? So now we start to make decisions about the jobs that we're going to take, where we're going to live, based on contributing to this movement, which is really to this egregore, right? So now we're just sacrificing our life to it, right? Literally where we live, decisions about where we live. One thing that helped me kind of break a little bit out of that was when my daughter was born. We're living in Newark, and I'm confronted with sending her into a horrific school system, and I just couldn't imagine making that work. Like, why would I couldn't sacrifice her to it. And in Greek mythology, Agamemnon must sacrifice. That's how he begins the Trojan War, to appease the god. There's a god that's against him, so he has to sacrifice his daughter in order to get the winds to blow so that they can get to Troy. And so he does that.
And
he
at
sacrifices his daughter.
At that time, it was to not sacrifice your daughter on the altar of public education, such as it was, where we were living, you would be called petty bourgeois.
Right, that's a petty bourgeois
there was
decision.
No worse insult.
Right, it's a petty bourgeois decision.
That was
right.
The scarlet letter at that time.
Being called, so petty bourgeois would be a small business person, an individualist, right? Making individualist decisions. It's more like being called privileged, right? You don't have to send your daughter to that school because you're privileged. You can leave. But there's other people that can't leave. They're not privileged. They're stuck there. So you should also go there and do something to make it better. But making a bureaucratic institution like a public school in an inner city better,
So where did you
and
end
we
up?
were grinding as hard as we possibly could for, at that point, by the time my daughter was born,
Where
we
did
had
you
been
actually
at it
end up
for
putting
10 years. So
your
then
daughter?
I moved to Highland Park and moved to a
Yeah.
suburb of New Brunswick, which had,
Right.
reasonably good schools, but still sacrificing our, living. I was thinking about this just the other day. It was the pride that I took in my shabby living conditions. Right, because that was an emblem of your proletarianization,
Right.
right, your commitment to the working class, right? So where some people might take pride in their nice clothes or their fancy cars or whatever, I took pride in the shabbiness of my things, the
Right.
shabbiness of my
And we
car,
called
the
it that.
shabby
We called it proletarianization,
proletarianization,
which is
becoming
again like an inversion and an insult to working class people who are really trying to improve their lot in life. And we have something like access to higher education, say, and there was a tendency to just kind of throw this stuff away because it wasn't working class.
right. And I think even, yes.
You'll recall.
And so you think about what a powerful mechanism this is, right? I mean, it is a mechanism of social control and limiting, right? It's controlling you and limiting you and directing you in certain ways. Leaving Newark was a blow to my relationship with Baraka, who I had become kind of close with, right? And he was kind of that was something that he was pretty disappointed with. And so to escape, so that was something that helped me to escape.
Let's say a little bit about Amir Baraka, because again, our listeners might not be super familiar with who he was, but for us at that time, he was larger than life. I mean, he was such a potent force, and not just. I'll say this for myself is one of the things that really drew me to him is that he put art and politics together. And when I came into the community organizing and study circles, we were studying the Marxist-Leninist classics in our 20s.
Right.
Amir Baraka was as closely aligned with like the jazz movement and talking about writing the biography of Max Roach or helping him with his autobiography. And like, so when he would speak, it was as much spoken word, like Gil Scott-Heron type spoken word poetry, and infusing that with political ideological ideas, but in a way that leaned heavily into the art form, the spoken word, the jazz. And so it was always infused with this spirit.
There is good and there is evil, no God. And the backwardness of evil worships death, the earth, and calls the sky barren and empty, thinks space is a nothing filled with them and what they know. To be an animal and forbid humanity from appearing. This is what's going on.
Those two things together is really what drew me. Also, as coming as a free thinker, I'd spent the year before I got involved with this project, having quit college and traveling around the country on a motorcycle, like in search of myself, discovering psychedelics, discovering, just the world outside. And then I come in and, there's this extraordinary force with this legacy that goes back to the Black Panthers and everything, that came out of the 60s, and the beatniks, the poets, Allen Ginsberg he was friends with. So yeah, this was a deep water that we found ourselves swimming in.
Right. So Barack is coming out of the Black arts movement. He's the kind of main force there, and the inventor of Kwanzaa, right? Yes. Literally, like inventing Kwanzaa. And then I think you're right. He was able to fuse politics and art and make the politics way more interesting than they otherwise would have been.
The masters of the earth are the creators of death and pain and loss and ignorance and poverty and disease. Who would want to live in a world full of ignorance and violence and murder? The refusal to turn with on and see the sun and make the soul instead rest upon this place with one leg.
Really, when you would go to his performances, he had a kind of a real shaman quality, and not like the kind of corny new age shaman journey. You're going to meditate with drums or something, He was really, because the shaman is the community's spirit guide, so that's what he was for that egregore, and he wasn't really on his own trip with something of realization. He was just pouring forth that egregore, which happened to be a political egregore.
A one-eyed jack, right-handed, full of worms. Who would lie about the world's self? The only royalty is reality. The only divinity is the ability to understand the future. There is good and there is evil, but there is no God. And the devil is he who do the evil.
And that's the thing that made, I think, his art more interesting than a lot of political art, Usually people try to be political with their art. It's terrible. The art is terrible. It's terrible. And unfortunately, I think even in Baraka's case, the art is amazing, but it's so timely that it's not going to last as long as it might otherwise have. I think to get out of that egregore, to get out of that thing, one, I had been moving away from the left, but Baraka died in, I think, 2013. Is that the right year?
It's 10 years.
Yeah. So that I remember weeping at his funeral, and I have a really strong feeling of affection and admiration and love for him. But I do remember feeling a kind of freedom also and a relief when I didn't have his disappointment.
It was potent
around.
It was potent,
around. And interestingly, Raz, his son, won the mayoral election after he died. I mean, it was that year. He probably was on track to win.
Yeah.
But that was a long-standing goal of Amity from the day we met him, I think we met him.
Well, it was seen as
on
like a passing of the torch. When Raz Baraka won, Amiri's second eldest son, won the mayoral election in Newark in 2014, just after his father died. It was that
May, so he died in January, I think, and it was May was the election.
Right then.
It was in the middle of the campaign.
Widely seen as like a passing of the legacy.
Well, yeah.
And that was the goal of all of this, was to seize political power.
Right. That was always what we were talking about, and
which I think frames this egregore, because we're seizing political power. Like, the power is a real thing. Like, people with political power can make things happen. They can leverage ideas on society and bend things to their will as politicians, as legislatures, and so forth. And that attraction to that kind of power was very much, I think, at the heart of the leftist project that we were participating in.
Yeah. And then in hindsight, or looking at it now, the left is in charge of the world somehow. So now I feel like we were more pawns than we might have realized, right? So you have someone like Soros funding the left. Why is he doing that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If they're really, and then when you start to look, like I remember a book that was very influential for us was that Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man. Still an interesting book in many ways, right? He's talking about kind of just not having a spiritual life, not having even a cultural life, not even, just kind of working, and like something that one of the reasons I really rebelled against that work was, watching my dad work really hard, but basically was like, go to work, watch TV, maybe watch the football game, maybe vacation once a year, go down the shore or something, but really just work and TV and dying. And that's what that One-Dimensional Man was about. So really interesting book, but funded by the Ford Foundation. Right. If you look at the back,
Right.
it's produced by the Ford Foundation. So why are they funding seemingly radical leftists?
So
right?
Soros, it's interesting because it's topical now that Elon Musk has been tweeting about George Soros.
Well, he's getting a little bit of exposure because he's the one funding all these DAs
the district
that are letting the
attorneys
cities
that are
go
promoting
crazy.
these no pursuit laws and letting no bail and letting criminals basically run roughshod on the streets. And George Soros is promoting it. Elon Musk, interestingly enough, has been saying, yeah, he's behind this project to dismantle our civilization as we know it. And that's
seems like he's so right as a young leftist, as a really an anarchist, right? Some sort of anarcho-communist. This would have been great, right? You could see, like, if you follow like the George Floyd riots, rebellion, as we would say, there were some pretty sophisticated kids out there when they were talking about how they took over those police stations. They're using pretty sophisticated tactics, right? That so there's definitely, some of these younger anarchists on the ground are, trying to manipulate or maneuver in that context. And then Soros seems like he's just making it easy for them, right? And so then when you go back and you think about like the 60s and those rebellions in the cities, what was the real outcome there, right? You had so-called white flight, but really that was white middle-class people leaving the cities. Then they were getting destroyed, and then bigger money came in and just kind of scooped that, big capital came in and kind of scooped that stuff up for cheap.
right.
And that's even that happened after 2008. Single family homes get scooped up by BlackRock.
Rinse and repeat.
So in some ways the left are just pawns, and the enemy or the people that they're attacking are middle-class Americans, because there's a lot of wealth there,
we're going to run out of time,
if you scoop it all up.
That's a great. All right. So Keith, I think that's a really salient point, because what it does is it points to a motive in how the left can be used, the left as a sort of collective, as the group think that goes into leftist organizing and ideology, and how that could be manipulated against, let's say, the best interest of the participants involved, who might be involved as we were, for really, just good reasons. Like, we're compassionate, we wanted freedom, we wanted people to not be, beat up by the cops for no good reason, this kind of thing. But when you bring it to that point where people are led to violence in the street, where buildings are being burned down and already hard-hit inner city neighborhoods are being gutted, small businesses, some of them have been there for decades, this is happening all around us here in Seattle, are now fleeing and folding. Well, you have a suppression of commercial real estate rates, and like you get the Black Rocks and all them that come in here and scoop up the commercial enterprises, both the businesses and the real estate itself.
Right.
And then the middle class Yeah, it's in the mom and pop shops, and the which are at the heart of like the fabric of a well-functioning social order are being devastated.
Right. So that's the what's going on now, right? They're basically what they did in the 60s to those middle classes in the cities, they're kind of doing again, but to the country as a whole. And I think even letting the border be open and having kind of mass immigration without any control. And then if you kind of talk about like the whole claim that Trump was a racist was just the idea that he didn't want to have open borders. He just didn't want to have immigration without, lawless immigration, right? If you don't want lawless immigration, you're a racist. So that's kind of a crazy proposition, right? If you're trying to have a stable society, but if your goal is to destabilize the society, then that makes perfect sense. And the destabilization of the society, I think, is the way that they will be able to, or the theory is that they'll be able to extract that middle class wealth, right? And so there's property there. There's single family houses, right? If you own your own house, why not have BlackRock own it? Then you can rent it. Having the historical theory is that freedom is based on owning property, right? And so the proposition of Marxism is that freedom is not owning property. Freedom is somehow the working class is going to be the government, is going to be the state, and then everything's going to be owned by them collectively. This is not.
You will own nothing and you will be happy.
Right. That was that. And so that was kind of the Marxist dream. But you see, the problem is that, and this was the problem that started to emerge with Lenin, or in Lenin's theory, is there's the Communist Party became the rulers and the working class were subjugated to them. So there wasn't actually this thing where the workers were in charge. And this is the reality is that human beings are not equal, unfortunately. Not everyone is as smart as everybody else. And right. So not everyone can really do the things that are required of a free person. And not everyone is capable of self-government. And so what their response to that is no one gets to be self-governing, right? Since not everyone can be self-governing, no one can be self-governing. We're going to take everyone's property. We're going to run everyone's lives because not everyone can be self-governing because some people aren't capable of it. This is the problem with Marx, I think, is that the theory that the working class is going to take power and run the society in its own interests, and those are going to be the interests of everyone, just is not viable. It never was viable.
It's so interesting to me how neatly that concept dovetails with what the World Economic Forum is putting out nowadays. And what I find fascinating, I found this fascinating for a long time. Part of what helped me sort of break out of the leftist egregore is that both I'd say both communism and capitalism are materialistic, are based upon materialist worldview.
Yeah, Heidegger said that the United States and the Soviet Union are metaphysically the same. It's kind of deep, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
The premise is materialism, right? Materialism is a premise. Philosophical materialism, and even just a kind of crude form of materialism. The point of life is just to, have stuff, seek pleasure.
And they're both products of the machine age, of the proletarianization, the introduction of factories, the abandonment of traditional societies in the countryside, and
the separation of science and religion into
separation of science and religion. Yeah. Yes.
And so this is the result. And Marx, one of the debates on Marxism between the so-called reformists and the revolutionaries is capitalism just going to become socialism and communism of its own free development, or is violence necessary? Right? That was always that's the big debate, right? If you're a serious militant, violence is necessary, but there's a whole wing of Marxist theory that says violence isn't necessary. The system will naturally evolve into socialism. And I think that's, that's what the World Economic Forum is saying also, right? The system can naturally evolve. The so-called elites can still run everything. They can still live large. I mean, people on the right make fun of the climate change activists, and it's almost like a cliche now to point out that, like Leonardo's flying around in a private jet, or but we had this idea also. This is in the Egregore, right? We are doing the good work, therefore we're kind of beyond hypocrisy. We don't have we can fly in a jet to fight climate change, right? Because what we're doing is so important that we don't have to, we have to get on the other side of the world tomorrow. Even if we're, going to have a huge carbon footprint, that's fine, because I'm going to make it so that there's no one else using carbon.
Contradictions be damned.
Right. So that's actually the whole elite idea of these people in the World Economic Forum, right? You'll have nothing. You'll be happy. I'm still going to have a private jet. I'm still going to have my yacht. I'm going to still have my spot. I'm still going to have armed guards. You're going to have nothing. You're going to be disarmed, and it's going to be great. And I'm going to be your benefactor.
Yeah. So part of the Egregore is we're operating under foregone conclusions, and the getting there, it's like, well,
by any means necessary.
Right.
Yeah, by any means necessary. By any means necessary. Right. And if it takes a private jet to fight climate change, then it takes a private jet to fight climate change. And so, and that's the whole. I mean, that's where I think you get what's happening now gets kind of revealed, right? Because they don't have to. People pushing for mass immigration don't have to live with the consequences. When you're in the lower middle class, like we were when we were proletarianized, you're in the lower middle class, so you're you're kind of like the upper crust of the poor and the impoverished. So the homeless people are knocking on your door because you live right next to them, right? And so you're the one that's like giving them your money and your change, and has to walk over them and step by them, right? If you're in the gated community, you don't see homeless people, right? You don't have to deal with that.
Well, what
stuff.
they're doing in New York City right now, they're starting to house homeless immigrants in public school gyms.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah. Like, there's your sanctuary city, and I've got my whole family is immigrants on, up one side and down the other. I've got Burmese boys and I've got Argentinian boys, and I have my ex-wife and my wife are both, first generation immigrants to the United States that had to, go through all of the processes of establishing themselves here. They didn't just come across the border, because they didn't just go up in El Paso, Texas, and force their way in and leave it to the locals to deal with, like you're saying, the extreme consequences of, like, what do we do with this situation? Never mind, this god awful fentanyl crisis, which is just like, there's no check, there's no. But poor, you can't have a functioning organism without a skin, without an impenetrable barrier, that on some level is acting as a filter to ensure the health of the organism.
Right.
That doesn't exist.
Right. Remember when they had like that march that was at the caravan? There's like 10,000 people coming, and the thing that I immediately, because I have experience organizing people, right? We organize these Rise Against Police Brutality. Now how hard it is to organize 100 people, just to get 100 people to do something. So you got 10,000 people to leave their homes and march from where they're from, like Honduras or something. Like, they're going to march across like Central America and New Mexico.
It suggests a higher level of orchestration.
That's a very sophisticated undertaking that requires a lot of money. There's no way that's a grassroots movement.
And again, like you said before, what's the purpose of that? What does that serve?
Right. So somebody's organizing that,
ultimately.
right? somebody's organizing that. Somebody's organizing it. And even like the Soros thing, like I hate to just point to him because it's got to be bigger than him, right? Although he has a lot of money, so he can certainly do that. But it's a whole. It's an egregore. It's a right. It's part of. There's a whole kind of structure that's supporting that he's part of, but that's bigger than just him.
There's always somebody bigger, and it's all like peeling the onion, where there's always another man behind another curtain, it seems like. So, I look at this and kind of going back to what we were talking about, where both socialism and capitalism are projects of materialism of the modern machine age, and the pulling society out of traditional structures, out of the countryside, away from nature, and really, when you get to it, away from the spirit. And I think that's something that you and I both share in common, is that as we've pulled ourselves and helped each other and supported each other out of this, this egregore of leftist politics, leftist ideology, we both, through our own path and our own way, found ourselves more closely aligned with matters of the spirit, transcendental ideas, and and I know for at least in my experience, I grew up very Catholic, and my parents were both Christian. I went to church and the whole thing, and then I just for 20 years abandoned and rejected all of that, as many do, in lieu of atheism. And that kind of was, that was part and hand in glove with leftist politicking. And part of what helped me get out of, pull away from it was, as I started to open back up to, a sense of divinity, and aligning myself with, a divine purpose, with the light, with spirituality in general, and not in an apologetic way, but just fully and really feeling it. I realized, wow, that, first of all, that can't, you can't worship two masters at the same time. Like I could no longer embrace a thought form that adhered to a separation of spirit and science, for instance, or structuring society as an architect, like designing social structures around simply like a machine aesthetic, as like modern architecture wants to do. And then realizing, and I've come to this in the last few years, is realizing that this whole dichotomy, this contradiction between spirit and spirituality and science, is really a false dichotomy. It's to me, that's the great lie. It's a false science. It's scientism. It's the kind of science that leads people to give up their own like humanity, or their own like sense of self-value, and trust the science, and
because that, once you start saying things like that, you're talking about, we said this before, now you're not talking about science is a method. Right? It's not something that you could trust the method, I guess, but trust the science, believe in science. That's not, science is a process. It's not a thing. In fact, right, if you look at tradition, the difference between science and art, science is the kind of theory and art is the practice, right? That was the kind of old, right? That's the liberal art kind of understanding of science and art, right? So people say it's more of an art than a science. Well, science is the ideas and art is the practice, right? There's a science to architecture, and there's a practice of building, there's right. And so that's where, and in reality, things come into contradiction, because sometimes the architect designs something that doesn't really make sense when you're trying to put it together, right?
Often.
Right? And so these are the issues. But one of the other ways of thinking, I think, the egregore is that it has like the kind of similarities to the cult, right? There's a kind of cultish part of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Taking you away from your family and those traditions. And I'm in the same kind of position as you, where I abandoned the religion of my fathers and grandfathers, and I'm like, what a terrible thing I did. right? And some like, why would I? They gave me this tradition, and I just was like, ah, it's nothing. Like
Mhm.
and it's not just my shortcoming, although it is, but it's not just that, because that was not just the egregore that we're involved in. That's the whole culture, right? The whole culture is that your family's traditions aren't really worth anything. Your
Mhm.
father is a buffoon, actually. Right?
It's the
It's
dismantling of the
Homer
family.
Simpson.
Mhm.
He's whatever. The honeymooners, like you're the
Married with
where is he?
children.
Yeah, they're just the clown. He's just
Yeah,
the. Why would that matter?
yeah.
Um,
That's the depiction that we grew up with, that fathers are clowns.
they're clowns,
Yeah.
and that's a those are really deep. Those are deep attacks, right? Those are really deep spiritual attacks. Um, and it's not that the 60s, that spirit of the 60s that we found interesting, the libertinism, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not that there's not something to that critique of the kind of ponderousness of the 50s, father knows best thing. It's not that that was some, maybe it was, but it probably wasn't some idyllic thing. But the just tearing down of everything with no idea of what you're doing is a disaster. Right? And that's where we are now, right? The whole critique of Western civilization and the patriarchy, it's all very adolescent and superficial and juvenile. And even the critique of sexual mores just doesn't take into account the simple thing that, like, if you don't have birth control and abortion, like, you can't just run around having sex with everybody. I mean, you have a
Yeah.
normal civilization.
One requires the other. But the
Right,
fathers knows best thing, like I just thought of this, is that that's very much tied to the suburbanization of society. It's like, we're we're neither in cities nor in traditional rural settings.
right,
But so along with the suburbanization of the family comes all of the frustrations that go along with this. Like, we're basically recreated the family unit as this nuclear, mom, dad, and the kids, and that's that. And that was already like a crystallization of a stage of fragmentation that had preceded. We had the World War, we had the Great Depression, we had the proletarianization,
right.
and the disrupting of the rural life, all preceding that. And so naturally, it's not going to be an idyllic, framework.
Right,
Like that
right.
father knows best model is not, it's not really, it's not wholesome. Father's probably drinking a lot of whiskey because he's nursing his wounds from the war, and
Right.
mom's
So
probably
there's a
on
real,
Valium, and the kids are,
I think that, yeah, especially as it started to collapse. I think that I mean, when I look at my growing up in the suburbs in the 80s, it was pretty great in hindsight. For as much like
yeah,
EUI and
yeah,
frustration I had about it, it
yeah.
was
The 80s,
pretty
the
great.
80s were pretty
Just
great.
basically,
Yeah.
it was almost like what you see like in around the Depression, where there's gangs of kids running around and it looks awesome, except that they were kind of starving and miserable. We had gangs of kids and we were well fed and reasonably happy. Like, we didn't have like any big issues. We just had our bikes and we could do that all
Yeah.
day long. Um,
We had
but
to
that,
contend with disco.
yeah, in hindsight, it's not so bad. So anyway, we're way off topic, but I getting out of the egregore, I think was something that was important. I think you kind of hinted at this, just supporting each other and just kind of questioning it, and then once you start to break it apart just a little bit, um it starts to unravel pretty fast. You start to see through it pretty quickly. But I think that's part of why you know, like a network like CNN was just freaking out because they had Trump on there. They have to really control the narrative and control the story, because if you have access to other information, you start to, you know, you start to break out of that, the limits of that mindset, of that thought form. And so they really, I think that's part of why they're so anti-free speech right now. And they have this whole thing that like your understanding of the world is so fragile that if you hear something that's not been fact checked, you know, your whole understanding of everything is in jeopardy, right? Like, why is this?
Jehovah's
Why is
Witnesses.
this? Right, like the CNN, the subject that's imagined by, you know, Anderson Cooper as watching CNN, is their understanding of the world that CNN has created for them is so fragile that, you know, Trump can, you know, say something that, you know, he thinks that the election wasn't fair in 2020, and his lies are going to just destroy everything. Like,
Right.
How is this so fragile? Right. Like, but that's where they are. Their belief is that any kind of dissension, you know, can, and it's true, I guess any dissension will start to undermine their,
that's the thing, it is true, and that's why they need to keep it coming at us 24/7 from all directions. Relentless. It's in the movies, it's in the literature, it's in, God, it's in everything. It's in community theater. Like, you know, again, my wife is like working on putting her play out, and it just, the woke mindset is just so saturating and insufferable. Again, we are in Seattle, so it comes with the territory.
You're in a rough spot, but it is like that. I think the whole country is like that.
The thought form is so boxed in, and in many ways, it's painted itself into a corner. And it's got, you know, what we've experienced these last 3 years, you know, with the bat bug and all of this, and it's like, you can't, you know, most people that I know that went along with the script refuse to talk about it now because of that fragility. You know, talk about fragility.
It's so that's, I guess that's the only thing, right? You have to be tough-minded enough, or just willing to say, you know, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I can change. Change isn't so bad.
That's critical.
I could be a different person.
That's humility.
Right? I think that that's one of the other problems, is that, you know, if your identity is so wrapped up with this thing that you can't accept that you could be wrong, or that you could change, you could be different,
that you can change and be different. If you're operating, as we said before, under foregone conclusions because you're already right, and it's just a matter of how you get there, that's really arrogant.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, that's totally ego driven.
Yeah,
if you can just kind of humble a couple of notches and you know, feel your way forward, lean into your intuition, like, what is your heart telling you, all these kind of things. What's the impact of my actions? What's really the impact of my actions? And you know, that and I think that goes right back to this, you know, for myself, like an awakened sense of spirituality. You know, there's voices that are more enlightened than my own that I can listen to. Right.
And then, or that you could be in conversation with.
That I can, right. That I can engage.
That you can engage, and you can listen to, and you could, you know, and I think that's the thing, is the fragility of the identity. And sure, it's hard. It's hard to, you know, people know you, and you were this, and now you're not that. You know, you know, you were a radical communist, and now you're not. You know, or whatever. You know, sure, you have to answer people's questions, and some people, you know, don't like it when you change, and they think that you're like whatever. Not, I don't know what they think, but they, you know, it upsets them that you change, or it
makes them uncomfortable.
Makes them uncomfortable
because it challenges them to.
It is a I think it is
to question themselves. I think
it is a challenge to them, because I'm always like, I'll talk it through with anyone about anything. I'm, you know, you have a better idea, tell me. but I've thought about this stuff pretty hard. So you better have thought about it a little bit because like you want to talk, you want to talk about white privilege. I'm like this thing about white fragility. I'm not afraid to talk about race. I thought about it a lot. I read Malcolm X's autobiography. I listened to Message to the Grassroots probably 20 times. I have the speech memorized. I'm happy to talk about any of that stuff with anybody.
The thing about white privilege is at some point several years ago, I realized that they were replacing rights with privilege. And it was like this word magic where what used to be like we're struggling for these rights became, well, that's privilege. And so, maybe you're not entitled to that.
The whole thing is crazy. And I almost regret bringing it up, but let's say one thing about it. If you go to Japan as a Japanese person privileged, if I immigrate to Japan and I live there and I'm going to go around and say, well, you're Japanese, you're privileged. Yeah, it's your country. What are you talking about? Of course we're privileged. It's our country. We're citizens of America. That's the whole point of being a citizen. You have privileges. Like, what are you talking about? Of course I have privileges. It's my country.
I could play devil's advocate here and talk about how Black Americans are, like Baraka would say this, to get back to Baraka, that they have been here for centuries and don't share in the privileges or the rights of citizenship.
Well, one, I think that's right. I think that the people that suffer the most from lawless immigration are Black workers. That's who's taking their jobs. Those are the jobs. Those, right? Those are the jobs. Those are the jobs that are being taken. That absolutely. That most of that lawless immigration is affecting their neighborhoods, their communities, and of course they know it. That's why if you actually get on the we were on the ground in those neighborhoods fighting for trying to get people to come together, and they're racist.
Yeah,
I mean,
pretty
Puerto
sure
Ricans don't like Dominicans.
That's what I was going to say. I'm pretty sure that established Latino communities or families don't like lawless immigration.
No, Latina, that's a college student discourse that has nothing to do with working class people. They don't talk like that. They don't know what you're talking about. There's Colombians, there's Ecuadorians, there's right.
If people were attached to the land the way they used to be, this wouldn't fly. That's one thing I think we can say for sure. If people were connected to the land and your garden was over there and your homes were over here and your boundary extended to over there wouldn't just be a border between the United States and Mexico that needed to be protected. There would be more of like I imagine, like I think about in the Celtic world of antiquity, there was like local kings that would control a certain boundary, but they might have 1,000 people, within their within their jurisdiction, and then over there's another local king. And there wasn't like an empire. I mean, part of what our problem is here, it's like there 300 and something million people and a senile president. Like,
so
how is it ever going to function?
I think that's right. But also, like, why is Guatemala so screwed up, or Honduras? Why are these countries so messed up that people are fleeing them in mass? Like, what's going on there? Like, right? Like, what is going on? Is it all United Fruit in whatever, or is something else going on? Like, why? Because it doesn't make sense to be that.
You can't look at just half of the argument. Right. There has to be, and the same thing with the inner city. Is it just because of police brutality, and is it just because of historic grievances, or is there something else going on? And there's a lot else going on right now.
Even if you go with that stuff, like they decimated the Black welfare, decimated the Black family.
Right.
Right. So the Great Society program, however well intentioned it was, decimated the Black family. It wasn't slavery, it was welfare. So that's a problem. Like, you know, when Biden was elected and he started like talking about student loan forgiveness, I paid back my student loan immediately. I just scrapped up the money. I didn't have that much left. I had like $4,000 left. I just paid it off. I'm like, I don't want that. It's bad for my soul to get that free money.
Because you were focused on something higher than this material relief.
Sure, it's nice to have it, but like, what does that do to you? That undermines it undermines your sense of yourself and your own abilities and your ability to do things.
And that's a transcendent principle.
And so then you could say, oh, well, you're privileged. Well, the thing is like, if you don't take any responsibility for yourself, because if you actually listen to Malcolm X, he was never talking like that. He was never talking about privilege or grievances or resentment. He was saying, let's build Black businesses. Like if you listen to what's Black nationalism? Black nationalism is building Black businesses and hiring Black people, hiring Black people. That's what he was saying. It has nothing to do with reparations or whatever, taxing people and what more welfare payments. He wasn't talking about that. That wasn't what he was talking about at all. So anyway, let's continue talking about this. I'm interested to get more at this egregore and this stuff too, and bring the spiritual stuff into it so that we can really think about it. I find it helpful. Hopefully other people find it helpful to because we're, you know, even though you and I were in this particular moment and really heavily influenced by this egregore, this thing is influencing this thing's got a hold of our country at the moment somehow.
Right.
And it's a bigger one than just, you know, maybe the one that we were being influenced by, but it's the same one, right? There's something, the left-wing egregore, that's part of the globalist thing. You know, it has like, I don't know, tentacles, or it's a many-headed hydra or something. Is it the COVID thing is part of it? You know what I mean? Like this thing is just really controlling people's minds. And we were affected by it, and somehow we managed to escape it for the most part. I mean, it definitely influences us, but I feel like mostly I'm opposed to it.
And there was valuable things that we were in it for that are worth holding on to, and, you know, at the very least learning from. But I agree, Keith, we have a unique set of experiences that could be valuable for
we should keep thinking it through. Yeah, our intentions were great, but they have a saying about those intentions.
Well, one thing I would point out is that we, you know, as compared to what happened these last couple of years, you know, around the George Floyd tragedy, is that we were highly disciplined. We you know, we were like the Malcolm X thing, and so we were militant but not violent. It's different than non-violent, like in the Martin Luther King sense, like the turn your other cheek, you know, concept. We were very militant, but we were always very disciplined. And if anybody was tending towards violent behavior, we could pick them out as agent provocateurs, and we would deal with them. But when we participated in countless marches, we shut down highways and police stations. There was never a rock thrown, let alone a building burn, let alone, you know.
I think that's a great point. I think that the agent provocateur thing is an important thing to keep in mind. The January 6th thing is a perfect example also, right? Because undoubtedly the feds were the ones encouraging the violence there, right?
Yeah, that's
there's no doubt about that. And if anyone does doubt that, they haven't been on the ground in those kinds of environments and just seen. I mean, I don't know, we still have those pictures, but we have the pictures from some of those demonstrations that we organized against police brutality, where we were so naive. The police were standing next to us and listening to us, you know, organize things, and they came to our meetings, and you know, that was just a kind of low level infiltration. But when someone starts promoting violence, you should be very wary of that person in any context, because unless you're defending yourself, it's a bad path. You're not. It's just not one that's going to bring you to where you want to go.
No, the system knows what to do with violence.
And the Governor Whitmer kidnapping, I don't know if you read on that. It's another story, but every one of those guys that was involved in it had their own Fed. And the guy organizing the whole thing was a Fed.
Right.
So it was their idea from beginning to end.
Keith, there's so many directions we can take this in. And
Yeah,
again, it's 30 years.
Let's powwow during the week, and we'll make a plan for a part 2.
Yeah. And I look forward to it. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, brother.
All right, Keith. You take care, and we'll talk, and we'll set up another conversation.
Yeah, let's do that. All right,
brother.
Good night.
Take care.